Welcome back to my YouTube channel, everybody. My guest today is Mr. Rod Leith, who's a former journalist for The Record. He is also today a private investigator, and together with him, we will talk about Richard Cottingham, a very famous serial killer who in the late 60s and 70s killed at least 11 women. We are actually not sure about the number of victims he made. Rod was also featured in the Netflix series Crime Scene, the Times Square Killer. So thanks for your time, Rod. Thanks for joining me today.
You're very welcome. I'm pleased to be here. As Leonardo said, I'm a former journalist. I was a reporter and investigative reporter for a paper called The Record in New Jersey, the Bergen County Record. And currently I am a licensed PI, a private investigator, doing consulting work in New York. Just as a background, I became interested in this matter with Cottingham. I was a reporter for The Record, and I was covering the town in which he lived with his wife, Janet, and their 3 children. And I was overwhelmed with the idea that a guy that came from a relatively average background, at least it seemed that way, could be responsible for some fairly heinous crimes in New York. You know, the notorious Times Square murders. And so I began to delve into this by talking to the investigators, by going out into the streets myself and talking to streetwalkers who were aware of the crimes and became aware of Richard Cottingham's comings and goings in New York. As a result of that, I wrote a number of stories for The Record, and a publisher by the name of Lyle Stewart became aware of my work and invited me to write a book, which they titled The Prostitute Murders, The People versus Richard Cottingham, which was published in 1980. Pinnacle Books came out with the book a little later in paperback, about 1984. And since then, there's been a number of people interested in this case because of the interest in serial killers. He is a hot topic. We know that because of his convictions, he murdered 9 women. And he is suspected of the murders of probably another 4 murders in New York and New Jersey. So I'm pleased to be here, and thank you very much for having me.
Can you show your book again, maybe a bit higher, because we didn't see it?
Yeah, well, the paperback was retitled The Torso Killer. The original, which I maintain the manuscript, I have the copyright, is The Prostitute Murders, published by Lyle Stewart. And I have been the subject of a number of interviews and a number of programs, including the one that Leonardo mentioned that was on Netflix just recently.
So let's start from there. In the Netflix TV series, what struck me most is that Times Square looked so horrible, a very dangerous place in the 70s, like a deadly mixture of sex, drugs, corruption, and things of the sort. While I've been to Times Square for the first time in the 90s, and it was beautiful. So this difference struck me. Was really like that in the 70s, so dangerous, so deadly, or did the producer exaggerate?
Yeah, the contrast is pretty extreme between what it looks like now and what it looked like back in the late 70s and early 80s. It was just when you got into New York, basically the area of Times Square was not far from the major public transportation terminal called it was called the 40th Street terminal. You would get off and walk into the area which is known as Times Square. I can tell you that from my own view, it was grimy. The police that I dealt with cautioned not to spend too much time alone. If and in fact, when I went out to interview streetwalkers, uh, so policemen I became associated with insisted on going along with me because that's just how risky and dangerous they considered it to be. That's because it was a haven for drug addicts. It was a haven for the homeless. And among the homeless, as we're finding out more and more today, are people who are really on the edge, who are mentally ill, totally unpredictable. So back then, less was known about this, and you were taking your life in your own hands basically by going into this area. It was filthy, it was grimy, the streets were dirty, the streets were littered with litter. It was just really a pretty filthy scene, and just as I said, pretty unpredictable. I point out to you that, in fact, even Richard Cottingham, who regularly went through Times Square in his work routine, would carry a knife for protection, because that's how threatened he felt being in Times Square. So yeah, it was a pretty drastically filthy area.
Well, one question we always wonder about serial killers is, were they mad in the first place, or did the environment that they grew in have an impact on them? So what I'm thinking of now is, did this crime-filled and sex-filled environment have an impact with his in creating this deadly personality, in your opinion?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, as I've pointed out to you, but based on my experience, based on the environment itself, it is conducive to behavior that is criminal, even to the point of being heinous. Human life is of such lower value. However, Richard Cottingham was a very, very unusual case. He was a man with a dual personality. He came across as very professional, very polite, very intelligent, very personable when he would be on his workplace, or perhaps just in average settings, with his family. However, there was this other darker side of Cottingham, a side that enjoyed torturing women. He particularly liked to thrive on women who were streetwalkers, women who basically couldn't protect themselves. They were out on the street. And so he had a dual personality, I believe. One like a Jekyll, the old story of Jekyll and Hyde. He was very, very professional appearing at in his regular life. He had a family, he had a home, so on and so forth. But then there was this whole other side of him that the streetwalkers found out about when they came in contact with him.
Okay, but what was the feeling back then among investigators? What made this case unique, and when they did understand that they were dealing with a serial killer?
Well, I think the thing that really struck people, including investigators, seasoned investigators, is the fact that this guy was, first of all, he was not a New Yorker. He was employed in New York, but he was not a New Yorker. He was a New Jersey guy, and they couldn't get over the fact. It really took them a while to make that connection, that he was from New Jersey. He was coming into New York. This means that the investigators in New York, and these are men who were assigned to the homicide squad there in New York, had to finally make contact with the law enforcement people in New Jersey, particularly Bergen County. They did not realize until this guy was arrested in 1980, that he was their guy. He was the guy that they needed to make that connection, that he was the guy that was murdering these women. He's kidnapping them in New York and bringing them over to New Jersey to a number of different hotels and motels that he favored. So that is the part of this that struck investigators, that he was not one of these guys from New York, from any of the boroughs in New York City. He was a Jersey guy, and that's what threw them off. And till they were finally able to make that connection when he was arrested in May of 1980.
Okay, I mean, what made this case unique for you guys in the press?
Well, I think it goes back to the overall profile of Richard Cottingham, that you know, we're used to seeing a family man. You know, he's got his family. He gets in his motor vehicle. He drives into New York, or maybe he gets on the bus or the train. We were used to seeing people like that all the time, and he's just an average person. But then the word came to us that he was responsible for these Times Square murders, which were heinous, which were national news, basically. When this thing hit in December of 1979, it spread certainly throughout the New Jersey and New York area. So this made it unusual that a guy that was one personality, one profile, you know, a family man, was actually responsible for one of the most heinous crimes in New York criminal history. And that was the beheading of these two prostitutes in December of 1979, taking their hands and their heads and leaving their bodies in a motel room, which he set on fire. And that's how it was discovered. The New York City Police Fire Department came to the scene of the Times Square Motor Lodge and found these bodies in room 417 that were partially burned. And it was unbelievable to the firemen when they discovered. They were prepared to save these women, and they were prepared to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to save them. And they discovered that they couldn't do that because they had no heads. It was really quite a very hard scene for these firemen to see, and they were overcome by it.
In this case, this is one of the few serial murders case where we have survivors, and the most famous one in this case would be Leslie Ann Odell, who managed to yell when Cottingham was trying actually to attack her, to kill her. So she brought the attention of the cleaning maid. This cleaning maid had her open the door a little bit, and Leslie Odell made a gesture, probably something like this, so that the cleaning lady understood that there was something that needed to be looked into. Did you speak to any of these survivors? Did you speak to Leslie Odell? What can you tell us about them?
Well, I know most about Leslie Ann Odell because of her testimony. She was a star witness, of course, because her case brought about the first arrest of Richard Cottingham. So we looked into what happened there at the Quality Inn. Just to background that a little bit more, the Quality Inn was a regular hotel, fairly modern, fairly well traveled, and very well traveled by Richard Cottingham, because he had started to bring his victims there as far back as 1977. That was the Marianne Carr case. But further up into 1980, when the Odell case occurred, he had just used the Quality Inn as the scene for one of his murders. He brought a prostitute there in May of 1980, and just a few weeks later, he brings Leslie Ann Odell. Now, I believe that the motel personnel had become aware of him, his comings and goings, and they may have had concerns. I don't know that for a fact, but when they heard noises, they heard noises coming from this room where he had Leslie Ann Odell, and when the woman who was doing the cleaning came into the hallway, and the doorway to that room was just partially open. This is when Leslie tells us that she tried to make some kind of a gesture. Cottingham was aware that she was doing this and he pulled her back. Nevertheless, the woman, or the maid, the room maid, suspected something was wrong, and she notified the front office, and the front office became aware that there was a problem in that room, and they were concerned enough that they notified the local police. So this was what tripped Cottingham up. And as I point out in my investigation, Cottingham, I mean, if you look at the dates here of the murder that he was responsible for was on May 4th, and he's back again with Leslie Ann O'Day on May just later that month, May 20th or May 22nd of that month, just a matter of a few weeks. Cottingham, I believe, was becoming unraveled, and he just could not contain his obsession with these women. His obsession was torture. He was into bondage, and he just couldn't control himself any longer. And I think he took risks. I think he was taking risks by going back. Think about it. He's going back to the same scene, the same hotel, and chancing that the personnel, the workers there, might become aware of him. And I think they were. I think they were suspicious of him and suspicious of things that were going on in that room, which is why that woman who looked at Leslie Ann and saw that she was making gestures, very, very, very frightened young lady, making some gestures for help. And I think that's what triggered this whole thing. And of course, as we know, it brought about an arrest that unraveled and solved many, many other crimes.
What I find surprising in this case is also that Richard Cottingham was not a society dropout, as sometimes happens with serial killers. This guy had a job, a regular job, and he was also a good employee. Is it striking in your opinion as well? What do you think of this?
Well, there again, he was. That's what could fool even a seasoned investigator. Might be a little reluctant to pursue a guy like this. After all, up until Leslie Ann Odell, he really wasn't known. He had had a couple of run-ins with the police, but these were the kinds of run-ins that you might overlook. DWI, and then of course there was a crime that he was suspected of but never convicted, and that was a crime involving a sexual attack in Manhattan. But he was never convicted, and because he wasn't convicted, he's not on their radar. And so, yes, he was a good worker. He was at Blue Cross Blue Shield in New York. He was considered a highly competent computer analyst, computer technician, and was a regular at that job. However, as they delved into this further, they found from interviews with his coworkers that he would come in on a regular basis and then disappear for a period of an hour or two during the shift that he worked. And this is when they were able to piece together that he was in different locations in New York during that particular time spot. And so the guy who looked like a really average guy, a good worker, reliable worker, respected on his job, his supervisors were very respectable, respectful of his competence. This is when a guy began to be seen as a suspect in some of these heinous crimes.
Well, here what happened is that at a certain point, investigation arrived at the turning point because of a mistake that he made when he let Odell make that hand gesture to the cleaning maid. Is it common in serial murders investigations that investigations have a twisting point because of a mistake done by the killer?
Well, again, I think it comes to this, that this is a guy that had been a very competent killer. But he had a side to him that he couldn't control. And that side was his obsession. And what happens to these guys is their obsession is so overwhelming that they began to take risks. And this young lady, Leslie Ann Odell, she was spry and young and very, very determined, very frightened and determined to get help. So he underestimated her ability to draw attention to that room. He took risks by being in that room, being in that hotel again. And yes, he lost control. He lost control of his victim, which is very unusual because normally he would have them in bondage. He would have them handcuffed. He would have them imprisoned. Somehow or other, she was able to escape that and get away from the bed and get over to the door. And he slipped. He slipped up long enough that she was able to make that gesture. This was a very foolish, very foolish and unusual behavior for a guy like Cottingham, who, as I said, had become a very competent murderer with his kidnapping and murdering of these young prostitutes.
Well, once an FBI agent also told me that it can happen that these people actually want to get caught so that they can show off how powerful they have been during their crimes. But maybe that's not this case. We don't know. Why do you think it took so long to bring this story to media attention? Because it was not very debated until a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't. There was publicity. There were stories. There were, of course, this book that came out about Cottingham, the Prostitute Murders, but it really didn't capture the attention of people who could bring it out and really raise it up as a serious matter. And I think this largely has to do with the population that he attacked, the population that he was drawn to, and that is the women of the streets, the prostitutes who work the streets of New York. There was up about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, greater attention to attacks on women, and what is called the Me Too generation evolved, in which feminists became very, very concerned about the vulnerability of women and the sexual attacks on women, and bringing it out that police were not paying enough attention to sexual crimes. However, that group, that mainstream that evolved, didn't really focus on the streetwalker, didn't really focus on these people these women, many of them young, who were probably the most vulnerable. And I think that has to do with why the major crimes that he was involved with didn't come to great attention from this particular movement, the feminist movement, because they're looking down their nose at these streetwalkers and not considering their vulnerability. It's a whole nother. It's almost like they don't want to be associated with that whole population. of streetwalkers. When these crimes became so sensationalized was when the media began to pay more attention to the most vulnerable, and that was the women on the streets. So it took time. It took time for that to happen, and that's why I think you didn't see anything as broadcast as this case, this series that was put out by Netflix just recently, when Radical Media produced this Times Square case and interviewed some of the investigators and some of the reporters, such as myself, that were involved in covering these crimes. It took time. The other serial killers attacked young men, and that brought great attention. The fact that these young men, many of them homosexuals, were given a great deal of attention, but the female streetwalker didn't get that attention until more recently. So I think it was an attitude of looking down your nose at these women who were streetwalkers.
Definitely makes sense. What lesson learned did you get from this case as a journalist or as a writer?
Well, as I point out before, I had been following Cottingham since the time of 1979, 1980, and I'd spoken to his family. I'd had dealings with his sister, and and of course I'd spoken many times to the lawyers that represented him, but I could not breach that wall, and that wall was to actually get to interview him. We tried corresponding with him. We tried to interview him, and the part that I put to him was that his story was going to be told, whether he liked it or not, and would he rather have his explanation, have his part in it, have his side in it told, so that his children would be perhaps aware of where he was coming from, and explain things, be able to explain things to them through the media. He refused that offer. The other part of this, which I regret not pushing with him, was the idea of going to his guilt, of getting to his guilt, that guilty side, about these two women in particular, whose body parts were placed somewhere by him. Only he knows. And I really regret not pushing his guilty side to explain and reveal the whereabouts of these two women. We're talking about the heads that were removed, hands that were removed and placed somewhere. The police scoured parts of Manhattan trying to find these body parts. He knows what happened to them. He knows where he placed them. And I do regret not being able to get to that side of him that would tell that story.
Well, Rod, many thanks for your time. Thanks again for joining me today. I think that your insight in this case is very precious and interesting for all my viewers. So thanks for what you did today.
Thank you very much for having me. I enjoy being with you, and good luck. Good luck.
My pleasure. Thanks everybody for watching this, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.